5 years ago, on this Shabbat, we were reeling in the aftermath of the attacks in France on Charlie Hebdo and on a kosher supermarket. 5 years ago, on this Shabbat, I gave a sermon inspired by the confluence of the Torah portion and the events. Parshat Bo, where we speak of Pharaoh's hardened heart and his inability to change course from his policy of Israelite enslavement. Parshat Bo, where we grapple with the fact that Pharaoh's heart was hardened not by his own doing, but by God's. Hardened Hearts and Terrorism. That was the title of the sermon. And if you mad-libbed that sermon, replaced the names of the perpetrators and the location of the attacks, I could give it nearly in its entirety today. 5 years ago, the perpetrators were radical Islamists, and the more recent incursion on January 6th were extreme Trump supporters, insurrectionists. The act of naming the perpetrators of extremist violence is itself political. It betrays how many of those in the same general philosophical camp you want to lump in with those active extremists. 5 years ago, when the world was upside down for different reasons, I noted that it's not just the extremists, the pharaohs and the religious and political zealots who are susceptible to hardened hearts. It's a trap for all of us in an increasingly chaotic world. I said, in our own moments of fear, we latch on to the overarching worldview that makes us feel most comfortable. We are scared, and we want to feel safe. And so we overlook the holes in the narrative toward which we are most inclined so that we can have a complete explanation, a way to control that which seems uncontrollable all around us. We double down on what we're inclined towards so that we can have a touch of certainty in the midst of chaos. We harden our hearts. But what if heart hardening is not an active action of God? It's not something that God does. It's a matter of how God built us. As humans, when chaos strikes, when our world is turned upside down, when we double down on what's familiar, we choose what we know. It's what we do. And we let in the evidence that supports what we already believe, and we dismiss or we downplay that which contradicts it. Pharaoh is built to revert back to his old way of thinking. And when our world is turned upside down, so do we. What we witnessed on January 6th was not our first cultural battle with extremism. And sadly, it's not going to be our last either. Our strategies for combating violent extremism will always face rapidly evolving conditions, and no one has yet figured out the perfect formula to prevent every violent extremist attack. As a religious leader who has traveled on delegations to England and France and Germany and Azerbaijan and Iran and Qatar to ask exactly this question, I have seen each nation's flawed attempt to battle with extremism, and in some cases dissent, that they categorize as extremism. The thing that I have most consistently witnessed is that a society's battle with extremism is most apt to fail when the commitment to political calculation outweighs the commitment to eliminating the extremism. Any modicum of success at marginalizing and defeating extremism hinges on strategies that are first and foremost rooted in our shared goal to stop violent extremism, not to defend or justify our ideological camp, not to fall into heart hardening ourselves. Because hard hearts beget hard hearts. And when that cycle of heart hardening gains momentum, it's nearly impossible to stop. Martin Luther King Jr. said that Pharaoh's hard heart tells us that evil is recalcitrant and determined, and never voluntarily relinquishes its hold short of a persistent, almost fanatical resistance. Today, We are surrounded by competing calls for healing and accountability, each demonizing the other side for playing politics with a national tragedy, each retreating into a space of ideological comfort, each a manifestation of a hardened heart, but each also reflecting a legitimate need. With no consequences for perpetrators and enablers, we invite them and the next generation to replicate their actions. How far out we extend that accountability is an important matter of debate, but accountability itself should not be up for discussion. And in the face of such extreme brokenness, healing is essential. Our nation's future hinges upon our ability to focus on what's next and not be held hostage by the actions of extremists. To heal, we must unify, affirming the core principles and truths that we all ought to hold sacred, even when we fall short of them. Accountability without healing is vengeance, and healing without accountability is appeasement. Accountability without healing is vengeance, and healing without accountability is appeasement. Tonight, I leave you with the closing words of the sermon, Hardened Hearts and Terrorism, in its unaltered form from 5 years ago, a reminder of what is still at stake. I don't know what blend to take from the left and the right, and what we haven't even thought of yet to fight terrorism. And that's terrifying to admit, given that the stakes are literally life and death. But I do know that hardening our hearts, hunkering down in our own philosophical camps, makes as much sense for us as it did for Pharaoh. If we are going to respond effectively as a society to this existential threat, we need to stop bickering with each other about who's philosophically right and focus on the real enemy of extremism in all of its forms. Shabbat Shalom.